Good evening and a very warm welcome to this evening's webinar delivered by Tom Hoctor, Senior Lecturer in our School of Applied Social Sciences. My name is David. I'm part of the student recruitment team here at the University of Bedfordshire, and this evening's webinar is being delivered to you as part of the Aspiring Bedfordshire project and the Premium Progression Partnership. If you have any questions for Tom throughout this evening's presentation, then please do feel free to enter those into the chat box, and I'm sure Tom will happily answer those at the end of this evening's session. So without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to Tom for this evening's lecture. Over to you, Tom.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dave. And that's great. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for this lecture on artificial intelligence in everyday life. I'm going to just introduce myself quickly so you have a sense of who I am. So as Dave's already said, I'm Dr. Tom Hoctor, Senior Lecturer in Social Sciences here at the University of Bedfordshire. I'm sort of increasingly interested in questions surrounding work, but also things like artificial intelligence, the future of work, what will work look like in, say, 10 to 15, even longer periods of time. A lot of my work is about thinking about, you know, how we conceive of society today, and also what we think that society might look like in the future. And that's kind of the aim of this talk, to think about how technology, artificial intelligence, and so on will influence everyday life now, how it currently influences our lives, and how it will do so in the future as well. And we have a little warm-up exercise. So for those of you who are able to leave comments, then warm up your typing fingers, because I'm going to ask you to have a quick think about everyday interactions with machines. So what I'd like you to do is to just think about what you did. We won't say yesterday, because yesterday was a Sunday, but let's say Friday. Have a think about what you did on Friday from when you woke up to when you went to sleep, and try and write down every interaction that you had with a machine of any kind. So what I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of time to have a think about that. Just a number is okay, so it can just be individual, unique interactions. So I think studies have shown that most people check their phone somewhere from sort of 40 to 50 times a day. So we don't need every single interaction with a phone, but you've interacted with a phone, that's one. If you then interact with a computer, that's another one, and so on. And so if you drive a car, that's another one. So have a think about that. And as you go through, I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to tell you a little story of my day. But as we go through, if you want to enter that number into the chat to sort of think about how many times you interact, unique interactions you have with machines, then do pop that in the chat. We can have a little bit of a talk about that. I'm quite curious. There's an average number that usually comes up when I do this talk, and I'd be quite interested to see where we get to. So I'll tell you about my Friday. So on Friday, I woke up when my phone alarm went off. Okay, so that was my first interaction with the machine. Then I got out of bed and I used an electric toothbrush. Right, so an electric toothbrush is my second. That's number 2. Then, because I had to go to work, I had to leave. I've got a machine, a little electronic thing that feeds the cat when I'm at work. So that's my third one. I turned the cat feeder on so that the cat wouldn't be hungry when I came back. Then I put some music on a laptop while I got ready, and I made a coffee. So I think we can call my little coffee maker. That's machines number. Where are we on to now? I think we're on to machines numbers 4 and 5 there. And then I had to go, right? I left, went to work, and I put on some headphones while I went, which use Bluetooth. So that's number 6. On the way to work, I had another coffee. So I used a card machine to pay for that. So that was one of those little card readers. So I think where are we at now? 7. And then I used my ID on the door at work to open up the door. The next thing I did was I logged onto my work computer. And then I had to go and get some books from the library. So I used the lift to get into the library, get to the floor I needed. I also used a printer, and then I used the library checkout, the machine that lets you check out books and return books. And then on the way home, obviously I was hungry because I've been at work all day. So I had to go to the supermarket, and I used a self-checkout machine to pay for my stuff that I'd bought. So that's 12 unique interactions with machines during the course of the day. And we can unpick some of those as well, because there's quite a lot going on in some of those interactions. Those are interactions with machines, but we've got lots and lots of things going on in the background of there. Some of these things are quite clever, like the work door swipe machine. It doesn't just, the card doesn't just tell you the door's open, it also tells you who's gone in and out. Okay. So I've got, I think I've got about 12 interactions there. And that's not counting what I would refer to as passive interaction, stuff that I'm not done anything. So a CCTV camera that picks me up as I walk past, I've not done anything there other than walk past. I've not consciously engaged with that machine, not done anything. We've not really interacted, but that still happened. The same for an internet router, right? I don't even really notice that they're there, but my phone is constantly connecting to different Wi-Fi connections as I walk around. That's another one that I'm not even really conscious of. My phone understands that that's going on, but I can't see that, right? And also things like automatic doors, sensors. These are all machines, and they're all machines that are linked up in quite interesting ways. They're not necessarily intelligent, but there are things going on there, right? Algorithmic things going on. Data is being collected. There's whole quite interesting processes happening as we move through the world and as we interact with things around us. And what's quite interesting, or what I quite enjoy about this little warm-up, is that very often we don't think about these interactions. They happen, but without us really particularly thinking about them, unless we make the effort to. Now, I don't know, this one's often quite a hard question. I think people are sometimes a bit stumped by it. But does anybody actually know the word for the study of human interaction with machines? It's not something that leaps to mind very often, but I would be very surprised if you haven't come across it in science fiction films or on television or just in general. It begins with a C. If anyone wants to pop that into the chat, then please be my guest. I'll give you 10 to 15 seconds while you have a think. IoT. Internet of Things, IoT. It's not necessarily the word I was thinking of, although it would be, the IoT, I think, would be an example of this broader concept. But it's a good guess. Human-machine interaction would be another way of putting it, for sure. It's not necessarily the word I was thinking of. I'll say it just to. So the word for this is cybernetics. We live in a cybernetic society today, and this, if you like, is what this warm-up demonstrates: is that without even necessarily realizing it, we are engaging in a kind of. We live, as I say, in a cybernetic society, but we often, that sounds like that's a very science fiction-y word. You think about people with metal limbs, and of course there are people with metal limbs, but it sounds very Blade Runner, but actually. Yeah, exactly. It's something that sounds quite weird and quite unusual, but actually our society increasingly is cybernetic. That's just a sort of fact based on the kind of basic definition of the word, which I think is quite interesting. So in the rest of the talk, we'll have a think about a few different things, and there will be opportunities at the end to ask questions, of course. So we'll talk a little bit about technological change, because again, we've just talked there a little bit about cybernetics, but technological change, we tend to think we know what that means, but actually technological change, we might have to think about that a little bit more broadly, perhaps, and a little bit more historically than we sometimes do. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a minute. We'll then take a journey through a supermarket supply chain. Now, other people are less fascinated sometimes by supermarket supply chains than I am, but I think that they do tell us quite a lot. And they tell us quite a lot about the future of automation and of algorithms. We don't technically speak, this talk is called Artificial Intelligence in Everyday Life. Technically, there isn't really such a thing as artificial intelligence in the sense in which we would generally understand intelligence. But we certainly do have machines that learn things, and they tend to be they tend to be algorithms which automate processes and which optimize those processes according to particular programmed criteria. Okay, and supermarket supply chains are a very good example of the ways that algorithms and automation are shaping consumer processes, but also labor processes, the ways that we work, who tells us what to do when we're at work, and things like this, which are of, I think, kind of general social interest, but which we often aren't sort of necessarily always thought about in that great detail. But we can access some of that just through taking a journey through our supermarket and its supply chain. We'll then think a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of automation. One of the key preoccupations of the social sciences is questions about how society should be organized, questions of justice, what's right and wrong. And automation is an interesting one, because, of course, one of the things about algorithms is that while they may find the most efficient way, according to the way that they've been programmed to organize things, other people, so humans and so on, may not necessarily agree with that. So as we'll see, there's often a significant amount of contest that comes with technological change, where people basically disagree. So some people are saying, well, this technological change is good, and other people saying, actually, we sort of prefer things how they were. And as we'll see, this is something that's already happening, but also something that is quite likely to happen. And then, depending on how we go for time, I might talk a little bit about the social sciences in general. But we'll, as I say, we'll see. That's an optional bit of the talk, perhaps. So technological change. When we think about technological change, we often tend to be quite struck by novelty. So we might be thinking about things like phones, about laptops, about Bluetooth headphones, and the kind of technological change that we've seen in recent time. And admittedly, the kinds of technological change that we've seen since sort of the 1980s and 1990s, with the advent of computers, the creation of the internet, and the various changes that have then subsequently taken place in how the internet works, who owns parts of it, how it runs. As somebody pointed out, the connection of the internet increasingly to things, so that we can actually network objects together that previously didn't have any sort of connection to each other. They can all be networked now. We tend to think about technological change as meaning that, but actually technological change isn't new, and it's as old as humans, and probably much older than that in certain respects as well. And we can actually start thinking about human technological change as going back to the first agricultural revolution in about 10,000 BC. Now, we don't necessarily know vast amounts about what was going on before 10,000 BC, because all we really have is the fossil record. But what we do know is that around that time, humans in certain parts on certain parts of the earth, certain places, began to settle. And they moved from what was substantially a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So at least significant portions of the year were spent kind of wandering and being fairly nomadic. And that switched to building, if you like, fairly settled communities. And the major technological change there was agriculture, including the growth of crops and cereals, things like wheat, barley, rice, and so on and so forth. So you could argue that actually we've had huge amounts of technological change, and that of course profoundly alters the way that society works. We go from a situation where most people spend at least some of their time effectively wandering around to a situation where most people spend most of their time in one place. Yeah, exactly. We have a massive technological shift in the way that humans organize their societies. There's a good book about this actually called Against the Grain by James Scott and David Graeber and somebody else whose name I can't remember off the top of my head. He's also a David, have just released a book about this as well, which is also very good. And as we move sort of forward in time, we get to the second agricultural revolution of the 17th to the 19th centuries, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, because it brings us on to a sort of interesting feature of how technological change often works and what often happens when technological change happens. But the second agricultural revolution is intimately related to something called enclosure. And if you think about the best way to explain enclosure is if you imagine the English countryside as you see it today, there was an old saying that a squirrel used to be able to run from Land's End to John O'Groats without ever touching the ground because the country was so wooded, it was just covered in forest. But when we think about the English countryside today, what we think about is neat hedgerows, fields with hedgerows and farmhouses and that kind of quaint quaint green rolling feel that we associate, I guess, with the English countryside. But that's actually quite a new invention that really kicked off in sort of the 1700s, when land was effectively taken away from the peasants, the people who'd been there before, often farming strips of land that was kind of had often been running in families for some significant time. People didn't tend to own the land, but they certainly had it by custom. And it was taken and enclosed with hedgerows, and it was then essentially what this is the move towards industrial farming. And what that does, and as we'll see, this tends to be a feature of major technological change, is what it does is it does overall increase the amount of food that can be produced on the land, but it also produces massive unemployment, because people who had previously lived on the land and farmed it were suddenly basically without anything to do, without any way of making a livelihood, and sometimes they'd also lost the communities in which they lived. So this is a huge dislocation in terms of British society, and also then subsequently in other European societies, and then societies all around the world. This is a major change in how humans organize their societies that's still with us today. We can still, it's marked all over the landscape. And most of those people who had been turfed off the land about 100 or so years before ended up in cities, and they ended up in urban areas, right? We've got a picture here of children working in textiles, I think what looks like a cotton mill. So most people who had been peasant farmers, perhaps 100 years before, by the 18th and 19th centuries, many of those people were living in cities, in urban areas, and probably they were working in factories. Some people were just doing kind of odd jobs here and there. But essentially we've seen another very significant change in a period of about 200 years. And so what I'm sort of getting at here is that we tend to think about technological change as being things that we've experienced in our lifetime, but actually human history is filled with examples of technological change. And this is interesting. I mean, it means that what we can do is we can learn from some of these previous instances of change, but we can also if you like, try and maybe do things a little bit differently. Because one of the things that comes with this technological change, as I've been hinting at, is that we almost always get contest to it, because people who've been farming a piece of land for generations didn't suddenly want to stop doing that and move to the cities to work in factories in sometimes very unpleasant conditions. So what they did instead was they resisted it. And we do usually get resistance to technological change. And we can actually, I think, see that in certain respects today. And perhaps that's something that we can have a chat about at the end. But there is this social side of technological change. And often when we have these discussions, when when we see things in the media or on the internet, these kinds of things about technological change, the social side is forgotten. It's often about, oh, well, there's a machine now that can write undergraduate essays, without necessarily thinking about some of the social components that's made that possible. And I think that is important because, as I was saying at the beginning, part of the sort of function of the social sciences is to not just report what's possible, but also to maybe think about its potential implications on people, whether it's good or bad, to think, if you like, about ethics and about, maybe it's possible to do things, but how do we do that in a way that perhaps also takes care of people? But with that said, technological change can be hugely beneficial, and it has been hugely beneficial. In most cases, technological change, including the examples that we just talked about on the last slide, increase productivity. So productivity, put very simply, is just more products in less time equals greater productivity. Another function of technological change is that it can eliminate dangerous or hazardous jobs. So very often the first things that get automated are things that people don't particularly want to do. So we have often we have machines in factories doing some of the most dangerous jobs in terms of production, the kinds of things that often cause people to lose limbs or to generally be in unsafe environments. It can also create higher paid work operating new machinery. And this is something that's quite hard to measure. It's very difficult to know how many jobs are lost and how many jobs are created, and whether on balance more high paid jobs are created. People who support automation often say, oh, well, some jobs will be lost, but we'll get new ones. And that, again, usually is true. That tends to be correct in historical balance. So before the invention of X-ray machines to X-ray bones and broken limbs and so on, there was no need for X-ray technicians. There was no need for people to there was no need for people who were able to read X-rays. Similarly, for software programming, and the history of software programming as a profession is very interesting. We don't have time to go into it in huge detail, but there was no need, obviously, for software programmers before there were computers. But that's an extremely well-paid job, at least for the time being. But what's also interesting, and I've chosen these examples on purpose, is that they also sort of lead us on to our other side of technological change. Because technological change is often very disruptive to established patterns of living. So we might get huge social reorganizations like we got with Enclosure. We might have a situation where people lose their jobs en masse. So we can imagine if a whole industry disappears, then we might well see people moving. I mean, we can actually see this in recent times in Britain when coal mines closed in the north of England, or when certain industries closed down. There wasn't really anything left to do in terms of work. So people often moved, they left, right? So it disrupts established patterns of living. It can also cause cyclical rises in unemployment. So we'll almost always get a short-term rise in unemployment if jobs start disappearing in a particular sector or industry, but we might also get rises in the medium and long term. And that's what happened, for instance, after Enclosure during the Industrial Revolution. And the reason why X-ray technicians and software programmers are a particularly interesting example is that those are jobs that were created by technological change, which in the sort of fairly medium term might disappear as a result of technological change. Actually, there are now computer programs that read X-rays better than a trained human can, because essentially you feed the information into the computer, and the computer can identify for you much more easily than the human eye where there are potential problems. Similarly, with software programming, it's now possible for some stuff like ChatGPT, these linguistic programming models, to produce relatively reasonable computer code without the requirement for somebody to actually write the code themselves. Not always the case. Often human written code is still better, but that's not always the case. And as time goes on and these programs become better, it seems quite likely that there will be less of a need for software programmers, and that we'll therefore have to find other things potentially for those people to do. And as a result of this, if you like, this two-sided nature of change, what we often get is what are quite interesting, actually, social movements opposed to technological change, opposed to automation, and essentially opposing changes to the way that society is organized. So in the 17th century, for instance, we get riots, acts of sabotage, and various other means of attempting to prevent fields being enclosed. Often these are performed by women, or interestingly by men dressed up as women. So we get a record, for instance, which is recorded in Federici's book Caliban and the Witch, that says 15 women, including wives, widows, spinsters, unmarried daughters and servants, took it upon themselves to assemble at night to dig up the hedges and level the ditches. Now, I don't know if anyone lurking in the chat would like to hazard a guess about any of this. So what we have here is a situation where we have essentially men coming along, employed by the local landowner, and they're going to plant hedgerows around fields. They're going to go in and physically enclose the land to kick people off it. And what happens is that we get riots, so people trying to stop these men from coming in and enclosing the land. We get acts of sabotage, so people might come at night and dig them up and try and destroy the hedgerows before they've had a chance to bed in and grow. And we'll often have this being done by women, or in other cases that are recorded by men dressed as women. Would anyone like to hazard a guess as to why that might be the case? All right. That was about 10 to 15 seconds, I think. So I'll just I'll answer the question myself. But the reason for that is that women couldn't be arrested. So at this time, in the 17th century, around this time, women couldn't be arrested or tried. So it was much better for the local villagers to send out women, or as a last resort, men dressed up as women, because they couldn't be arrested and tried. And actually, subsequently, the law was changed, so women could be arrested. But that's why these riots and acts of sabotage were undertaken principally by women. Later on in the 1800s, we get Luddites, mostly in the Midlands, Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, places like that, going into factories and smashing up machines, mostly textile machines. And again, it's a very similar reason. The Luddites, most of them were textile producers, and the machines could produce a lot more textile than they could, than a human can, much more quickly. And so basically, these people were staring down the barrel of unemployment and a huge change in their social conditions. So their solution was to go in and smash up the machines. Today, in a sense, not a great deal has changed. Today, when industries are automated, it's often met with strikes and sometimes with demands for fewer working hours. So there are various examples, including a very up-to-date one that I can give, but I'll wait until we get on to the next slide here. So what is automation? We've been talking quite a lot about technological change and these various other features, but automation at root refers to the replacement or supplementation of human labor with robots or computers. And a good example of that is from the 1970s and 1980s. By the time we get to 1988, the Ford Motor Company was able to make as many vehicles as it did 10 years previously while employing half as many workers. It had essentially been able to put in place a machine-based factory line that replaced the need for as many human workers. If we look at the recent RMT strikes and the ASLEF strikes, one of the things that the train companies want to effectively impose upon workers in those sectors is driver-only trains, with large portions of the railway being automated. And this is opposed by the unions, partly on the grounds of unemployment, but also the RMT's argument is that these things aren't safe, which is often a concern when things are automated. So How should we understand automation? That's our, if you like, our central question, or one of our central questions. Well, optimists would argue that while automation may remove jobs, it doesn't remove the need for human work. So we could go back to our example of our computer programmers and our X-ray technicians. We might not know what the jobs will be that will replace the jobs that disappear, but history has shown us that there will be more jobs, and there will be different jobs, perhaps jobs that we haven't even considered yet, because as technology develops and processes become automated, well, we might find that we actually need work in other areas. And pessimists tend to agree. So it's not really contentious to say that automation generally results in more jobs, because that's just a historical fact. But what pessimists say is that the kind of work and the conditions of that work which follows automation have often been worse than the kinds of work which preceded it. And that one is a bit more difficult to refute. If we asked our peasant farmers whether they preferred living out on the land in their villages or whether they preferred working in factories, they might have particular opinions about that. So the pessimist case is that the optimists are right. There will inevitably be more jobs after automation, but the jobs might not be that fun. So here is a sort of, again, I'll kind of talk us through a story here, but feel free to kind of do your own version along with me. So I quite like this exercise, because I think what it does is it kind of brings us back into everyday life and our particular thoughts about how things work. And it's a backwards journey through a retail supply chain. So I quite like to think about just my local supermarket, where I often will go and buy things, and the whole process. We could also obviously think about online ordering, which again is substantially automated. We can talk a little bit about that in a second. But what I'd like you to do, if you're so minded, if you've got, I don't know, a document open, or if you've got a piece of paper to hand, is to just think about what a backwards journey through a retail supply chain would look like. And again, I'll sort of tell a little story about that movement through the shop. So we'll start at the end, if you like, from when a customer pays at the self-service till. Okay, so we've done our shopping, we've got our basket of shopping, and we've got to the end of the process. And there's interesting things happening at this process. So if we think about various different supermarkets, we often have loyalty cards, and some of those loyalty cards are now phone apps. So at the very end of this process, we're paying with a card that interacts with the card reader. We just tap it. We might also have an interesting interaction between the data held on our phone, which might get us a discount or loyalty points, which we then also use with the machine itself, with the self-service till. The barcode, of course, is a form of technology, and all of this information that, as we put things through the till, is being logged. It's being logged, first of all, to calculate a price, but it's also being sent on aggregate back into computers that live in storerooms and warehouses. There's a central, if you like, database which is collecting information about purchases live as they go through. And as we move back through the shop, we'll start to see why this is taking place. So what we'll often see is people, as we go around the shop, we'll see employees with little guns, who like their little gun-looking machines. The name of I'm sure they've got a name. Yeah, JT has just said that loyalty points are used to collect shopping data on you. Yeah, absolutely. The reason the loyalty points are there to be able to market better to you, really. It's a sort of form of data collection where you get a reward, but you're actually also, if you like, helping the supermarket. And we'll see as well that this process is the scanner. There you go. Thank you very much. We'll see as well that as we move backwards through the supply chain, this process where we get the loyalty points and where all of this scanning is taking place at the tills informs the entire supply chain. Okay, and more it does so almost not in exactly real time, but it does so in a way that's completely different to how supply chains were organized even 15 or 20 years ago, which again is interesting and also has massive implications for how we work. But so if we move backwards, I'll stick with I won't move ahead too much. If we stick with our employees in the shop, they might well be going around with a scanner, and the scanner will interact with the barcode on the product, and it will basically say to them where they are with that particular product. How much is left on the shelf? Usually you can see with the eye how much is left on the shelf, but it will send a request back into the storeroom, which hits another computer that's in the storeroom, which says, okay, we've got X many boxes of this back here, so we'll put one out to go onto the shelf. And then if we're low in the stock room, which we sometimes will be, we'll send that one out to the distribution center. Now, one of the interesting things about the way that supermarkets are organized today, comparatively to how they were organized, as I say, 15, 20 years ago, perhaps slightly longer now even, perhaps we're getting for 25 years ago, is that supermarkets historically often had to be out of town because they needed large warehouses with fridges, freezers, large storage areas. They needed probably to be able to keep about a week's worth of food at any one time in a warehouse, especially for the larger supermarkets. These days, many supermarkets have got much smaller. So we have the proliferation of Metro, Express, local, these kinds of shops, which are sort of maybe, they're bigger than a newsagent, but they're smaller than a traditional out-of-town supermarket. The reason why this is possible is because of something called just-in-time supply. And just-in-time supply, which I think we've got over on this slide, I'm going to have to go in order, aren't I? And just-in-time supply, what it means essentially is that the order is called, a notice is sent out to a distribution center, which will probably be fairly close by, and that will be ordered to the shop where it's running low. So we have, if you like, automated supply chains, which are running extremely quickly, but where the shops are actually, they've never really got more than 12 to 24 hours of products in them. And we can think of various examples in recent times. I can think of one particularly big example where just-in-time supply slightly came a cropper. I don't know if anyone would like to post in the chat any examples that they can think of from quite recent memory of where shops experienced issues with stocking shelves. I'll give you a few seconds just to have a think about that one. If you can think of any recent instances where supermarkets struggled to stock their shelves. Yes, exactly. COVID. Yeah, we had the issues with toilet paper, past the various kinds of things. I'll tell you an anecdote from when one of the very early on in the lockdown was that I was running quite low on toilet paper, and I just happened out of the window to see my neighbour coming back from our local shop carrying several packs of toilet paper, and I ran out of the house to go and buy some, because there was, people were essentially panic buying toilet roll at the time. And the reason why this was happening is because if you have a just-in-time supply chain and you've only got 12 to 24 hours worth of stuff in your warehouse at any one time, and suddenly the supply chain experiences a huge disruption, like, for instance, nobody being allowed to travel or cross, yet true, shortages of lorry drivers after that, which was a result both of the pandemic, but also of changes to our relationship with the European Union in the UK. That was also related. It kind of just caused a nasty bottleneck of more than one thing coming together. But it wreaked havoc on these automated supply chains. And it did that because essentially the regulatory environment had changed. Petrol prices as well. Yeah, that's true. The regulatory environment had changed. And so what had previously been quite a seamless process whereby the computer would ping a signal to a distribution center from where I am in Luton, that distribution center is probably just outside Milton Keynes. And that Milton Keynes distribution center would ping on another signal to a much larger warehouse usually from a subcontractor or outsourcer who would supply the product to our distribution center outside Milton Keynes. Suddenly, large portions of that process stopped working very well. Right, there weren't enough lorry drivers. People couldn't cross international borders as easily. So there were big backlogs in terms of getting products over the channel. People got sick. There were all kinds of other issues with getting food onto the shelves. And actually, that just-in-time supply chain that had worked very seamlessly before that suddenly became a huge liability. That was why there wasn't any toilet paper, because of something that the week before had worked extremely well. So it's quite interesting. Yeah, exactly. Suddenly there was a huge change in society and in, if you like, regulatory and the political context that the system wasn't used to and couldn't adjust to quickly enough. Right, so we'll crack on just in case. So this slide in many ways is really just my hobby horse, but I do find this quite interesting, and I quite like to go between. I like thinking about the relationship between my little local supermarket and this map, because I think it's quite interesting. I think it's also one of the great functions of the social sciences, is that we're always interested in linking the stuff that happens on our doorstep with big forces that happen potentially quite far away. And I've not put an explainer on what this map is, but would anyone in the chat like to hazard a guess as to what it is? What I also particularly like about this map, by the way, is that it would look almost exactly the same if it were 200 years previous. So this is a map from today, but if I'd taken this map from, you know, the 1800s, it would look more or less the same as this. It is indeed trade routes, yes. It's shipping lanes. And the reason why it would look the same 200 years ago is because fundamentally the geography of Earth doesn't change that much, and some routes are much, much safer than others. So going around the Horn of Africa, which is possible, is much more dangerous than the other routes, right? So going through somewhere like the Bosphorus, which is the bit between Turkey and Greece, that's much safer than it is going around the Horn of Africa. Or Suez as well, obviously, before you get to the Bosphorus. So this is a huge map of shipping lanes and trade routes. And what's interesting about it, well, there's several interesting things about it, actually, from my perspective, one of which is relatively how little shipping goes to North and South America compared to how much goes to Europe and Asia. But what's quite interesting is that we were talking about our distribution centers and our just-in-time supply, but the reason why this map is here in this part of the presentation is because actually our shipping lanes and our global trade routes stretch all the way now from Britain, Europe, North America, over to Asia and back again. So we have constant transit of goods by shipping across these lanes. And this fundamentally is the first step. So if we wanted to do a very detailed analysis of a value chain, say we wanted to follow a product, so, you know, maybe we were interested in, you know, following Global Village is a very nice way of putting it. Yeah. If we wanted to follow, say, a shirt that had been produced somewhere in South Asia, probably, we could follow it along the shipping lanes into the European Union or into the United Kingdom, where we could then follow it from a distribution center all the way to our checkout, right? And we can have these, what we have increasingly is very large and very long automated supply chains, or supply chains where significant portions of it all along the way are automated. And they're interesting and sometimes fairly complicated reasons why this is the case. So as I was saying, these supply chains are large, they're complicated, and typically now they're run by algorithms. So one of the things about computers and automation and algorithms is that it allows us to cut up bits of supply chain. So historically, what companies would do, and we're talking really before the 1970s, is that large supermarkets would often own an entire supply chain. So they might own almost everything from the point, say you want to get eggs to your supermarket somewhere in Bedfordshire, you might own more or less the entire process. You might not own the egg farm and the chickens, but you'd buy them off a farmer. You transport them in a lorry that the supermarket owned, employing a driver that the supermarket also owned. You might then transport that into a warehouse that was owned by the supermarket and employed people in the warehouse to move the goods around. It would then be driven to the shop by somebody employed by the supermarket, and so on and so forth. Today, what we see is that these retail supply chains have been cut up. So often what we find is that the supply chain is very fragmented and we have many different companies all along it. So someone owns a farm and someone else is employing the people who work on the farm, and they're selling the eggs to another company which transports it to the distribution center. And that is run by an outsourced firm with people employing agency workers and so on and so forth. And the reason why this is possible in a way that it wasn't really possible before is because we're able increasingly to run these supply chains on a more or less automated basis, and that they can still run more or less efficiently because algorithms are sufficiently complex and developed to allow them to do so. And they've been able to cut time out of almost all of these processes through increased automation and use of algorithms. We won't worry too much about lean management and the Toyota way because I've just got an eye on the clock. But the other thing that's interesting, we've sort of talked about this already, I've kind of already made a few comments in this general direction, but these days we tend not to be talking so much about warehouses as distribution centres. So what's interesting about this, and linking in with this idea of just-in-time supply that I've been talking about a little bit, is that stuff doesn't tend to stay for very long in these places. So this, I'm pretty sure I chose the Milton Keynes Little Distribution Centre. I think that's a local one in, well, it's Bucks, not Beds, but not far away. But actually, this isn't a warehouse in the traditional sense. We're not going to leave things in here for very long. Stuff might really just arrive and then leave again. Okay, it's more like a distribution centre. It's sort of more like a hub in which things arrive, and then the algorithm says, right, this has now arrived. We've logged that it's arrived, and now it's going to be going again quite quickly. Okay, it's a distributional mechanism. It's not storage. Okay, so it's interesting as well that technology has changed the basic function of how quite a lot of these things work. But there's another side to that. There's a nice story there about this technological change and these long maps and all of this quite interesting, these interesting value chains. But of course, we've been talking, or I've been talking, really, I've been telling the story about shipping lanes and these impersonal forces. But of course, there's lots of people all along here in these jobs, working in these situations, working in distribution centres, in shipping, in producing things like garments or eggs or computer chips or whatever it might be. And these just-in-time supply practices and the rapid order rates and the need to fulfill the order rates very quickly at distribution centres produces very significant pressure in those supply chains. So machines send the orders to workers who fulfill them, right? But they have to do so quite quickly. And increasingly, this is done either orally or through text by a computer that's mounted on a wrist or elbow. So in Amazon warehouses and distribution centers, really, I should say, we'll find that people often have things mounted either on their wrist or their elbow, and that effectively that device will tell them what to do. They have little autonomy in terms of how they perform the task. And what's quite interesting is the way that we've talked, as I say, quite a lot about automated processes and how machines change the way that supply chains work and how machines interact with these systems and so on. But actually, what's interesting when we start looking at the labor part of that process, the working part, the stuff that people do, because of course there are still people in all of this, is that people are increasingly operating as appendages of automated processes. So one of the things about this automation is that, yes, it's increased the speed. Yes, in some ways it's reduced the cost. Yes, it's made some of the processes more efficient, putting aside global pandemics and petrol prices and stuff like that. It has done quite a lot to make some of these processes quicker and more efficient in some ways. But it's also made some of these systems less good to work in. It's not that nice to be told what to do for 12 hours by a machine on your elbow that just tells you what to do and really doesn't give you much autonomy in choosing what to do and when to do it. That's not necessarily the most sort of pleasant conditions in which to work. Generally, we might find that we have less task discretion if we're being told what to do by a machine that says you need to make this delivery by this time, or you need to put this into that box in this amount of time, otherwise the order is going to be delayed. We have less task discretion, and people quite like task discretion at work. We like being able to make decisions, even small decisions, about the stuff that we're going to do and when we're going to do it. And the other thing that we might see, and I think probably isn't that nice as well, is general de-skilling. So whereas historically, if we worked in a supermarket or in a warehouse or whatever it might be, what we'd find is that people understood how to do a whole variety of tasks, that people developed skills. If we think about the self-checkouts, for instance, one of the questions that I quite enjoy about the self-checkout machines is, what happens when they break? I don't know if anyone in the comments knows what happens when they break. I'll give you a little while. 5-10 seconds. We have a longer queue. Yes, that's very true. Yeah, okay. Well, what I'll say is that it gets fixed. But what happens is that somebody raises a ticket, and then an engineer who's on call, who isn't necessarily resident in the shop, unless it's a very large one, comes and fixes the machine. But the machine just gets turned off in the meantime. And people working in the shop don't necessarily know how to fix it. In fact, they probably don't know how to fix it. Whereas historically, if we had a dodgy till, then there'd be someone on the site who knew how to fix it. And often we'd have a number of people through a training process of upskilling people who knew how to perform that work. So what we see is that, okay, yeah, automation does make some of these tasks easier. It does make certain things more efficient, but it also produces effective de-skilling. We know how to do less things as workers than perhaps we would have done if we'd worked in previous generations in a workplace. So how will automation affect us? Well, potentially it will have wide-reaching and quite unpredictable effects. But one thing we can say with relative certainty is that it's very likely that more and more occupations are going to be fully or partially automated, and that over time, this will include knowledge and service sector work. And actually, there's lots of examples already that you may or may not have heard of Mechanical Turk, which is an Amazon-run, I think, platform which raises jobs for things like translation, editing. It's referred to as micro work. So what we're seeing increasingly is that it isn't just warehouses and distribution centres, but increasingly white collar work of various kinds. So knowledge and service sector work is being automated as well. And following current patterns, this could lead to deteriorating industrial culture. So we might find that workplaces basically become less nice. It could lead to worse pay and conditions, because often what happens when processes are automated is that wages and salaries in those sectors go down, and that we get more the proliferation of something called precarious work, so work with insecure contracts on a temporary basis, and these sorts of things. This is where trends are currently going. And Gautier will argue that these patterns are paving the way for more and more robots, essentially, to do to sort of engage, if you like, in activities that previously were the preserve of humans. So I've got a little question here. We can say what I'm going to do. I think is I'm going to move on to sort of a more general open question, because we've got about 10 minutes until we're supposed to wrap up. But this, we could easily have a discussion, if you like, about this. But can we imagine a more socially just form of automation? I think that's perhaps one of the most important questions as social scientists studying things like work, automation, artificial intelligence. Is we probably need to think about this quite urgently, perhaps. It's like, how can we imagine a kind of automation that's more just? Now, this is a video that I would ordinarily have played, but unfortunately, I'm not currently able to do so, but we can post a link to it in the description. I think it's quite a nice little philosophical take on robots in an Ocado distribution center, which I think also gives you a nice idea of how automation is currently working. So I'm going to wrap up there and invite questions, and for Dylan to pop back in, or Dave, whoever is going to pop back in, and I'm going to just leave this here and ask, generally, what do you think the future will be like? We could talk about any kind of artificial intelligence, automation, things like that. I'm very happy to have a chat or take any questions.
Thank you ever so much indeed, Tom, for that fascinating lecture. So my question really is going back to your question. What do you think the future holds on this topic of automation?
What do I think? That's a good question. Personally, I think there are a number of possible outcomes. I think fundamentally what we'll see is that some element of automation is actually desirable, and that it's not preventable. That there's and also in some instances that there isn't really any great benefit to preventing tasks from being automated. I mean, one of the things about automation is that if you use automation to to essentially remove humans from a dangerous industrial process, then that's surely a good thing. I think we can all agree on that. I think what will probably come alongside it, though, is industrial strife, essentially, is a serious breakdown in industrial relations. And what we see is that that's already happening. So we have, essentially union organizing at Amazon distribution centers and so on and so forth that kind of disrupt these processes, that resist them to some degree where they can.
Thank you. So we have got a couple of questions coming in. This one here is from Sajid4. Are robots and algorithms taking over? Interesting.
Not yet. I think it would be quite interesting to see. I think the other thing about robots and algorithms is that there's usually human. But we don't, as I was saying at the beginning, we don't, technically speaking, have true artificial intelligence, in the sense that there's no machines currently that possess sentience in the way that we would generally understand that to be the case in terms of humans and animals. So no, there's usually human agency somewhere along that process. So humans have produced algorithms and robots that behave in certain ways, and so we can. They're not taking over just yet. It's still quite a human-run thing.
Excellent. More of a comment here from JT. Automation is the way forward. Honestly, we can't hold potential life-saving technology for the benefit of job security. Have you got any thoughts on that, Tom?
I do. I mean, I think that's a fair point. When we talk about socially just automation or variations on that theme, it's not necessarily about protecting individual jobs as such. It might be that it's actually a good thing that humans don't have to do some jobs anymore. It's more that if somebody's been driving lorries for 25 years and then suddenly we've got self-driving vehicles and don't really need that person anymore to drive a lorry. Well, what do? Do we just say, well, never mind? Or do we say, well, okay, but let's offer you some retraining, let's offer you some support so that you can go on and do something else? So I think that's what we might mean. Some people, of course, would say actually automating things is just bad in general, but I think it's also about how do you manage a transition to a situation where there's fewer jobs that we're used to.
Excellent. A couple of other questions have come in, Tom. So how can we prevent automation out of our control, which we disagree with?
Government regulation would be one way. I think that this will become an increasingly hot topic as more sectors become more automated. People will want governments to act, to provide some kinds of security. I mean, I think one of the things we were just talking there about job security, but people may not necessarily be as fussed about job security, but they will be very concerned about income security. So that maybe that they're not necessarily wedded to their job doing whatever, but they will want to know that they're not going to starve. So government regulation would be, I think, one area. I think we'll also probably see communities organize themselves. We might well see community level resistance to automating processes, and that, I think, in workplaces that will probably be through trade unionism, but in other areas we might see all kinds of community organizing. We already see people giving up social media. This is there's a whole subgenre of articles on the internet about people, I don't want to have Snapchat anymore. So it's people will resist these things, and they will increasingly, I think, do so in more organized ways. But we're probably yet to find out what that's going to look like.
Excellent. Thank you. We've got time probably for two more questions. This one here. We used to consider the Turing test a way of measuring sentence. Do you think this is outdated now?
I can't answer that question off the top of my head. I did read something recently about attempts to design new tests for artificial intelligence, and there was that guy at Google who claimed that Google had invented a kind of sentient chatbot, and everyone thought he was mad. But I think that may have been able to just about pass the Turing test. I don't think it I don't know. I can't answer the question off the top of my head, so I won't try. But
we will try and get an answer, and we'll put it on the YouTube link, which I see you're watching us through. And final question is: so, as a social scientist, being multitask is important for the future. So, I think it's about actually. Do you think people need to be more to be able to multitask more for the future?
I mean, I do. I think in some ways it's. I think it's some of these debates are often put in terms that I think make people panic a little bit, and I suppose one thing I would say is that there is a degree to which we can do things about this as individuals. We can, there aren't that many lathe operators anymore. So if I decide that I want to train as a lathe operator, then that mightn't be a great choice in terms of my future employability potential. But I think that actually, this is going to have to be a socially negotiated transition. Yeah, it's great if you've got skills to your bow, but I think as well, people adapt over time. I mean, I meet students who are sort of 18, 19, who can do things with social media and computers that I'm sort of looking at them going, well, I'm not even that old, and I don't really understand how to do that. So I think there's no need to panic, basically, is what I'd say.
Excellent. Well, we are just about out of time for this evening. So Tom is from the University of Bedfordshire's School of Applied Social Sciences. They offer a range of courses from health and social care through to criminology and sociology. And we've put all the courses there in the chat box. If you would like more information on these courses, and of course, please do visit our website at beds.ac.uk. Also, later on this week, on Wednesday evening, 5 till 6, we have got our School of Education taking over our platform, and they will be delivering a session on education and what it's like to be a teacher in schools and colleges, both primary and secondary. So if you are interested in education, then please do join us for that one. As I say, that's on that Wednesday at 5 till 6, again, through our Facebook and our YouTube channels. And then finally, we've got a whole range of really exciting lectures coming up this term. For more information on those, please do visit beds.ac.uk/workshops, and you will see all of the online workshops that we're delivering this term and also next term as well. But for now, thank you ever so much indeed, Tom, for that fascinating lecture. If you'd like more information on our courses in our School of Applied Social Studies, then please do visit our website or do come to our open day. We have got an open day coming up this Saturday the 21st of January at our Bedford and our Luton campuses. But for now, thank you ever so much, and I hope you have an enjoyable evening. Thank you very much indeed.